And finally, we come to Class 4, Protestantism at large. Class 4 is unique since it does not claim the church outright vanished, as Class 1 does, nor that Christendom is basically apostate with later reappointment, as Class 2 does, and it doesn't claim that we can rebuild the New Testament church from scratch, as Class 3 does. Rather, its claim is essentially this: the church continued, but became gravely corrupted, and the Reformation was a necessary correction. Class 4 seeks to affirm continuity whilst denying the historic apostolic church's authority, specifically the Catholic Church. So let's see how this view holds up in light of Scripture, history, and reason. Scripture treats the church as a reliable adjudicator of disputes, Matthew 18, and the pillar and foundation of truth, 1 Timothy 3:15, with obedience commanded to its leaders, Hebrews 13, verse 17. If that's the case, how can the church become so corrupt as to justify schism in order to reform or recover the true church? If, say, the medieval church went astray, then where was the true church for however many hundred years prior to the Reformation? If the true church was the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church was corrupt, then that means the pillar and foundation of truth failed, something Christ explicitly says will not happen in Matthew 16. Furthermore, to say that the church was corrupt and therefore its leaders no longer had legitimate authority, thus justifying operating outside their jurisdiction and against their wishes, begs the question: by what rule do you determine when the church's teaching is still binding versus when it's to be disobeyed? If the pillar and foundation of truth teaches error, then out of fidelity to the truth, you ought not follow it. But that's a contradiction in terms. The pillar and foundation of truth by nature cannot teach error, since that would, by definition, cease to be the pillar and foundation of truth. You therefore have two options. Either the church is the pillar and foundation of truth, and we ought to submit our wills and intellect to the truth and obey those in authority over us. Or the church fell into some form or other of great apostasy, and therefore lost its legitimacy, and the pillar and foundation of truth was lost, only to later be restored. Hence, we may disregard the leadership of the false church with no strain of conscience. To justify schism, you must assert that the pillar and foundation of truth taught falsely. But by what standard do you judge the church to teach falsely? To say, by Scripture, is to say, by my interpretation of Scripture, which boils down to personal opinion. And simply put, isn't a good standard, since those that would be considered heretics by Class 4 adherents could and do make this same argument. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons both make appeals to their interpretation of Scripture in their claims to validity. Both of these groups are broadly considered to be heterodox or heretical by most Protestant groups. Also, let's talk about Matthew 18. Quote, "Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." In a passage about church discipline and governance, Jesus says that their decisions will be made with divine concordance, saying that wherever two or more are gathered in his name, he is there in the midst of them. And in Revelation 2, it says Christ walks among the churches and knows their works. If that is the case, then how can the entirety of the visible whole of the church be led astray and rule or teach falsely to the extent the only solution is schism? The Protestant reformers didn't split from a particular corrupt parish or local body, they split from the unified whole. If the church is able to make binding judgments with divine concordance, by what standard do you say the judgments are illegitimate and therefore non-binding? If the church can be wrong to the extent that schism is justified, then Christ's command to tell it to the church in Matthew 18 ceases to be the final court of appeal, and the command becomes mere advice subject to appeal. In short, the church is not presented in Scripture as a court that can be overruled by personal persuasion. Further, a court which you can always overrule by personal opinion or conviction isn't a court at all. At the time of the Reformation, the public, historic Episcopal communions claiming continuity with the early church were overwhelmingly Catholic and Orthodox. And while the Reformation was particularly a schism from the Western Church, many of the so-called unbiblical teachings and practices, which were the biggest issues in the Protestant Reformation, were also held by the Orthodox churches. This presents a huge issue because the Catholic doctrines regarding the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, apostolic succession, and the nature of the priesthood, Marian devotion, icons and statues, prayers for the dead, while they may be articulated slightly differently in the Orthodox churches, they are essentially in agreement over these points. Overwhelmingly so, especially in comparison to the Protestant alternative understandings on these issues, both at the time of the Reformation and especially the views held currently by modern-day Protestants. So while the Reformers may have said, Rome has erred, they functionally imply that the public mainstream teaching of the historic church for many centuries was unreliable on matters central to Christian doctrine, worship, and authority. And that pushes them into Class 2 territory, which is a move most Protestants would hesitate to make due to the logical implications of such a claim. If the universal teaching bodies of the church led the entirety of Christendom into error regarding these key doctrines intrinsic to the faith, then multiple promises in Scripture have failed. The Spirit did not guide us into all truth, John 16. The gates of Hades prevailed, Matthew 16. The church was the pillar and foundation of falsehood, 1 Timothy 3. And in light of such failure, Christ clearly wasn't with us till the end of the age, but rather he stepped out for a bit, only to correct the errors later in the 16th century, Matthew 28. By rejecting the universal teachings of the Eastern and Western churches, the Reformers relocated ultimate authority from the Pope, bishops, and patriarchs to the local, ultimately individual level. This move has resulted in great variance even in the earliest days, as each sect rallied around its preferred leader, and crowds gave legitimacy to novel doctrines and interpretations which suited their liking or current understanding. Within the first few years, the writing was on the wall. Since Protestantism has no binding universal authority, there's no authority not subject to personal interpretation or persuasion. Every appeal to the text is an appeal to an interpretation of the text, and interpretations abound. Creeds, confessions, synods, appeals to history are all well and good in theory, yet they do not have ultimate binding authority and are consequently subject to one's personal interpretation of the text. Without a binding adjudicator, at best, competing bodies can agree to disagree and exist amicably adjacent to each other. However, this proliferation of competing bodies doesn't map well onto what Scripture says about the church. If the church is supposed to be visibly one, John 17, then a model that structurally multiplies competing communions is already under strain. Also, Class 4 frequently suggests major errors develop later, namely medieval accretions, so reform is possible without denying early continuity. However, the early church looks strikingly similar to the Catholic and Orthodox Church, and markedly different from the Reformers' supposed alternative framework, which is allegedly closer to the Church of the New Testament. This poses two dilemmas. If you say, well, the church fell away from the apostolic deposit, so the bulk of church history can't be cited as the right understanding. Then the question becomes, how early did the church fall away from the apostolic teachings? Was it immediately after the death of the last apostle, as Class 1 and 2 would suggest? After all, 1 Clement is late 1st century and stands within living memory of the apostles, yet we have no trace of an early counter-movement saying, Clement was wrong, this isn't apostolic. Or perhaps you could say, the early church only got some doctrines wrong, but were otherwise trustworthy. But that begs the question, by what standard do you determine which early church doctrines were legitimate growth from the apostolic deposit and which doctrines were corruptions of the apostolic deposit? Ultimately, who decides? If the answer is mine or my denomination's later interpretation of Scripture, then we are right back to square one. Private judgments cannot render universal decrees. Short of universal decrees, unity on any given issue is impossible. In short, if the key features you reject are present within living memory of the apostles, the late medieval corruption narrative can't do the work you need it to. This largely comes down to a question of what is the church for? According to Scripture, it's for visible unity so that the world may believe, John 17. It's for adjudication of disputes, Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 6. It is to safeguard and uphold the truth, 1 Timothy 3. The list goes on. Notice its function is that of service, a service to unbelievers that they may believe, a service to uphold truth to preserve the faith, a service to adjudicate disputes to preserve unity. If the church fails on an institutional level for multiple centuries, then it ceases to be able to operate in the service for which it was intended. If Christ's promises don't guarantee a recognizable, reliable church, then an ordinary believer is left with no stable place to tell it, no stable pillar, no stable unity, and no stable obey your leader's reference point. In short, if Christ founded a church for the faithful, its promised protection can't be functionally inaccessible to the faithful. There's another tension here I'd like to bring up that often goes unexamined. At times, Reformation rhetoric implies that the Catholic Church was really the true church for centuries until it wasn't, and that at a certain point, fidelity to the gospel effectively passed out of Rome and into the Reformation. But Scripture gives us no mechanism for an instantaneous transfer of ecclesial authority. The church is corrected through discipline and councils, not replaced by dissent. And historically, the Catholic Church did reform, which means the claim cannot simply be that it refused reform, but that it reformed insufficiently or incorrectly. At that point, the decisive judgment is no longer the church judging error, but individuals judging the church. And once that principle is admitted, the church ceases to function as the final court of appeal Christ established. Either the church remains the final court of appeal Christ instituted, or the church becomes judgeable from the outside. And once that principle is admitted, you've surrendered the very function Scripture assigns to the church. Or to put it another way, premise 1, the true church must be a final court of appeal and a stable public instrument for unity and truth. Premise 2, the Reformation model justifies separation by allowing individuals or communions to judge when the church has become sufficiently erroneous to disobey or break from it. Premise 3, a final court that can be overruled by private judgment is not a final court. It becomes merely advisory. Conclusion. Therefore, Class 4 cannot preserve the church's scriptural role while justifying schism from the church as a whole. It collapses into either Class 2 Great Apostasy logic, or it must admit the logical necessity for a continuous binding authority, thus undercutting its own claims to legitimacy.